I'm afraid, as Caribbean people, we are not going to forget our history. We don't just want to hear an apology, we want reparation.
Well, I hate to disillusion you, Mr Lammy, but the UK has already said no to the 15 Caribbean nations who have, as at the 15th of October 2024, demanded £200 billion from the UK in compensation for the transatlantic slave trade.
So he's now a Caribbean person as opposed to being a British person who happens to be Foreign Commonwealth Secretary.
Yes, I thought we had a British Foreign Secretary.
I thought so.
I wasn't aware that we had a Caribbean as our Foreign Secretary.
Be sure to subscribe, give this video a like and drop a comment. It will mean a lot to me.
What surprises me is the 15 Caribbean governments have unanimously agreed to put this on the table.
The table that presenter is talking about is the Commonwealth Summit scheduled for the 21st of October 2024. So yes, the slavery reparations debate has cropped up yet again, triggering all the usual passionate and heated arguments both for and against the proposal that countries who, over a period of many years, brought people from Africa and took them to Caribbean islands to work for free should now pay substantial compensation to those Caribbean countries.
And as has been pointed out, the wealthy Victorian British families that made their money out of the slave economy, 1/5 of the elites of the wealthy class in Britain in the 19th century owed their money to transporting 3 million Africans across the waters.
I'd like to focus on the Kikuyu in Kenya. Elkins, a brilliant Harvard historian, reveals that the British detained not 80,000 Kikuyu, as official histories maintain, but almost the entire population of 1.5 million people. Inmates were used as slave labour, and those who disobeyed the rules, they were killed in front of the others.
A slave's children became slaves. Their children's children became slaves.
And it was called chattel enslavement, which meant that you owned the in inverted commas, I'm using that in inverted commas because it's a very dubious notion that we can own another person. You own that person in perpetuity, plus all of their descendants, plus all of their property. You could tell them who to marry or who, you didn't allow them to marry. You own their children. So, I mean, chattel enslavement of African people was a very particular and very cruel, the cruelest form of enslavement of people.
Slavery came with plunder, rape, grievous bodily harm and murder.
White settlers in the Americas, in Australia, in New Zealand, in South Africa, in Canada, in Rhodesia, in Kenya, they simply took over land that wasn't theirs, often slaughtering and purposefully exterminating the local indigenous population, as if they were vermin.
By the end of the 19th century, the fact is that India was already Britain's biggest cash cow, the world's biggest purchaser of British goods and exports, and the source of highly paid employment for British civil servants. We literally paid for our own oppression.
Thousands were beaten to death or died from malnutrition and typhoid, many of whom were children. Interrogation under torture was widespread, with many men anally raped, using knives, using snakes, and using scorpions. Women were gang raped by the guards. Men were rolled up in barbed wire and they were kicked around the compound.
I don't think that the government's recent giveaway of the Chagos Islands to Mauritius has got anything to do with the said demand from the 15 Caribbean islands in question, and I think that the use of the Chagos Islands transaction as an explanation for the said demand is just a way for anti-Labour commentators to poke fun at the government.
What I basically think this is coming from is, it's in the aftermath of the Chagos Islands furore, where basically people from around the world can see Britain is quite literally open for business for anybody who's prepared to come with a begging bowl and rattle it. The Labour government will hear your claims.
You know what this is, don't you? They've seen how woeful and weak our government is. They've watched Foreign Secretary David Lammy flippantly hand back the Chagos Islands, Labour using their vast majority to get policies through unchallenged. And these countries have thought, we're onto something here.
Keep in mind that the government has already said no to paying compensation. What is true, however, is that we Africans willingly sold each other into slavery.
Then we can go back and say, well, who was it who did the enslaving in the first place? Because it was not white people with large butterfly nets going into the bush, was it? No, it was Africans selling Africans to Europeans, willingly buying them, it must be said.
As that commentator remarked at the end, the UK and other slave-buying countries chose to buy Africans, and they came to us to get them, not the other way round. However, we can hardly claim not to have any blood on our hands ourselves, and our own liability for the transatlantic slave trade is just one matter that substantially undermines our claim for compensation. It's possible that the 15 Caribbean islands in question would have a significantly higher standard of living today if it hadn't been for slavery. This, however, as you can see, is extremely difficult to prove. Moreover, some scholars who say they've carried out relevant comparisons between former colonies and countries near to those places which were never colonised and which, prior to the colonisation of their neighbours, held a similar level of potential for economic prosperity, say that it's extremely unlikely that former colonies would be significantly better off today if they had never been colonised.
If the British never arrived in the Caribbean, and these people were left to set up their own country, perhaps it would have a bigger economy than China today. Perhaps they would be the most powerful and most wealthy nation in the world, and the only thing that stopped them, the only thing that kept them less rich than they might have been, was the dastardly British.
Sarcastic and contemptuous as is the expression of this question, as I've shown, it's a crucial question to ask and get an answer to in order to determine whether the 15 Caribbean countries seeking compensation for historical slavery have got any factual, if not legal, grounds to be doing so. This next commentator says no, and he's far from being the only one to do so.
The sad reality is there's no evidence to suggest that there would be any of the development that we've seen in Africa, or indeed anywhere amongst some of those colonies later on elsewhere in the Pacific and so forth, were it not for colonialism. The first thing to say, of course, is that the slave trade ended before actually the European nations began developing their colonies in Africa. So that's the first point to make. The second thing is, of course, Liberia and Ethiopia I mentioned because they were never colonized. So those are two states in Africa that never experienced colonization. Liberia was actually set up by slaves. But let's compare, for example, Benin in West Africa to the Caribbean, right? So the annual GDP per capita in Benin is $1,400 a year. It's $17,000 in Barbados. Life expectancy in Benin is 10 to 15 years shorter than it is in the Caribbean. So by every measure, it's impossible for me to see in what way the lives of people today have been impoverished by slavery if you are living in the Caribbean. Most of the Caribbean nations are middle-income countries who rank higher on the Human Development Index than Brazil or Mexico. And one of the reasons they're middle-income countries is because of their British colonial inheritance. The English language and the common law have made them able to become global players in the world economy. They've got all of the infrastructure of parliament and the judiciary and the civil service and universities and the police structure, all of the things that Britain left behind.
The British only built the infrastructure and the other facilities mentioned, or rather got their slaves to build those things, and only imposed their law system into their colonies for their own benefit. It just so happens that those things were also of benefit to the people that the British held in their control. They weren't works of charity by any means, and they are neither a justification for taking those countries over and subjugating the people to their dominance, or a reason not to pay compensation to those countries for having done so. And how reliable are the comparisons between former colonies and non-former colonies anyway?
Shall we compare, Jamaica to a country that the British never colonised, Haiti? Which is richer? Which is richer?
If the commentator is saying that the difference in the wealth levels of those two countries, Haiti and Jamaica, is due to Haiti's not having been colonised and to Jamaica's having been colonised, what proof, if any, can he offer to back that claim? He may well be right, but he should cite his evidence. How many countries that weren't colonised but were near to those that were colonised, and which, as I mentioned earlier, had the same level of potential for economic prosperity as the nearby countries that were colonised, have a lower standard of living than their ex-colony neighbours, a higher standard of living, the same standard of living? And where there are differences, what are the explanations for those differences? You can bring a claim against a dead person. You claim against the person's estate, the money and property that the person has left behind. In this case, you are a defined and proven victim of that dead person's wrong. Even if you weren't here, you may well have someone in your life, a spouse or a child say, who is legally entitled to claim on your behalf. There is no doubt about who the compensation that you are seeking should be paid to, and that includes the scenario where you're not here and someone else is legally claiming on your behalf. And because you, or again someone with the necessary legal entitlement, are bringing your claim within what is usually a 6-year statute of limitation, which means bringing a claim no later than 6 years after the grounds for the claim arose, your course of action is relatively recent. Not one of the 3 fundamental facts mentioned in the claim scenario that I've just described applies to any claim for reparations for slavery. Slave owning by the British ended nearly 200 years ago, meaning that any party seeking compensation for slavery today is inevitably way too late. The statute of limitation then works against those seeking compensation for slavery today, clearly, and that was fact 3. The slaves themselves are all long dead, so will clearly not be bringing a claim themselves. Likewise, anyone who may have been legally entitled to claim compensation on behalf of a slave is, again, long deceased. This defeats the requirement that A, the victims have to be both identified by name and able to prove the wrong done to them, which was fact 1, and B, that either the victims themselves or a legally entitled party should bring the claim, and that was fact 2.
Well, yes, that call for the UK to pay reparations to the Caribbean for its role in the transatlantic slave trade has been increasingly vocal. It's been led primarily by the Caribbean community. The Caribbean leaders argue that economic and social damage caused by slavery and colonialism still affects the region today, and they believe that those reparations, including compensation and apologies, are necessary because they think it will address historical injustices. But of course, there are plenty of strong arguments against it, and one hopes that if the King himself can't make them, maybe, as you say, Sir Keir Starmer might be able to. The historical responsibility and temporal distance are basically the biggest problems, because holding present-day nations and populations accountable for the actions committed hundreds of years ago suggests that there's a significant historical gap between the actions of the British Empire and today's population. And it's pretty difficult as well to figure out exactly who should be the beneficiary of those reparations, exactly who are the ancestors that deserve the reparations, exactly how much should it be, what should it be in order to compensate. It really makes it very hard to justify modern reparations, which, when we look at things like the Holocaust, where Germany has made reparations for stolen possessions and wealth, for example, from Jews who were persecuted, there's a much more easily traceable line to show that there are actual possessions, sometimes art, sometimes wealth, sometimes corporations, that were stolen, and therefore it's easier to make those reparations. And even the undertaking of those sorts of things has been difficult. Now, this is something much further ago, and I think it's far more dubious whether or not there is a strong case for it.
The arguments for slavery reparations come under civil law, tort law to be exact.
Reparations are fundamentally an issue of tort law. That's T-O-R-T, tort law. And the purposes of reparations is to put the victim back into the position they were in before the harm occurred. So if we were talking about this in the 19th century and there were people alive, I would absolutely support reparations. But we're talking about 200 years ago. That's 6 or 7 generations.
Reparations for the sins of the father shouldn't, whether logically, morally or legally, fall on the son or the daughter. That's what many people think anyway.
Let's be clear here. Britain does not owe a single penny to anybody in the Caribbean nations. This is nothing more than, some sort of avaricious cash grab by, by left-wing activists in the Caribbean, but also bad faith political actors.
Given this, there was quite a clamour in the media when, in 2021, the Council of Evanston, Illinois, USA, paid $25,000 to 16 black households in compensation for slavery, segregation and housing discrimination, the element relating to slavery having been, I believe, the main cause of shock and protest. That shock and protest, of course, didn't come from the beneficiaries of that windfall payment, because they sued the council for that money. In our ignorance of the criteria that those 16 parties had to meet to get that money, we can no less ponder the following.
So these people in the little town of Evanston, the black residents of that town, the people of colour, they're in line for $25,000 each because of the trauma of what happened to them during slavery. The thing is, though, that was 300 years ago. So why would anybody in their right mind say, this person here, who has no idea about slavery, has never experienced slavery, doesn't know anything about it, drives a Ford, works in the local factory, goes to sports events on Saturday, we're going to give them $25,000 to compensate for the trauma of this thing they don't really know about that happened 3 centuries before they were born. Is it just me, or is that utterly insane?
It isn't just white commentators who make that point.
As if, you know, someone of present day owes someone of present day who never experienced slavery some sort of reparations is absolutely ridiculous. I'm not sure if you were made aware of the example in the UK, particularly with this debate, but the BBC's very own Laura Trevelyan of you know, the very well-known Trevelyan family has paid £100,000 to the Grenadian government as a form of sort of slavery reparations for the fact that her family owned 1,000 slaves across various plantations on Grenada. And the irony was that the actual compensation that her family received for ending sort of slavery or to getting rid of their slaves was around, in today's money, £3 million. So she didn't actually even pay up to 10% of the money that her family received for getting rid of their slaves, but for somehow she is fronting that as some sort of beacon of morality. And you know, this obsession with slavery reparations is just a way for these white liberals to spit shine their halos in public and show how virtuous they are, when really they take a very ahistorical view of actual history and the nuances of these discussions.
I've mentioned that we Africans sold our own brothers and sisters to colonisers. We also owned slaves ourselves. We can't demand reparations from others for doing the same unless we ourselves are prepared to pay compensation.
Another jurisdiction that's called for slavery reparations is San Francisco recently, who's called for millions of dollars to be freed up for black residents as a form of slavery reparations. I actually have family that live in San Francisco and were part of the Akan tribe in Ghana. The Akans actually made a lot of money off the slave trade, and it didn't actually end until the British staunchly said, we're not going to be buying more slaves off you, and forcibly ended it in that part of the world. Wouldn't it be ironic for them to now receive slavery reparations even though their ancestors were enriched by the slave trade? These are the kind of nuanced discussions that we don't have. Even Ethiopia, for instance, formally ended slavery after pressure from the British I think in the mid-1940s, right? They were one of the latest African societies to end slavery. So this idea that, you know, history is not nuanced and that for some reason white people have been casted as these sinful slavers and should pay some reparations is completely ahistoric, and it completely misses the nuances that in that same vein there's so many people in Britain that could claim slavery reparations for the Norman Conquest, or for, you know, Irish people for the Irish famine, or, you know, even black Africans for the Arab slave trade of black Africans, which was far more brutal than the transatlantic slave trade. There's so many instances in history where this, you know, which demonstrates how nuanced this discussion is.
To pick up on that commentator's last point, how far back exactly should we go with seeking reparation for past wrongs? There's a simple answer, and I think you've already gathered it, most probably.
If you want to just go down the line of saying, well, these people were bad to my ancestors, so I deserve money, you can literally do that carousel for everybody, because there's no real cut-off point. The cut-off point is the end of recorded human history.
When, in 1833, the UK abolished slavery, former slave owners got a payout.
In 1833, a huge loan was taken out. The British government took out a huge loan and it repaid the slave owners, but it didn't compensate the slaves. And people may be shocked to discover that that was still being paid off as late as 2015. So we have a background in which the British economy, as other advanced economies, certainly gained huge advantage by unpaid labour, in our case particularly in the Caribbean, and that the British government after government, was paying basically reparations but to slave owners as late as 2015.
This may have been a matter of necessity.
But if that hadn't been done, slavery wouldn't have been abolished. That was a necessary condition of actually abolishing slavery, was getting enough people on side by literally bribing them. It's not a very nice thing.
But it no less infuriates me personally that no reparations of any kind were made to the slaves themselves. As one commentator said, they 100% deserved reparations. If you've enjoyed this video, I recommend you to watch this one next. I'll meet you there.